family and I have the privilege to go down to the beach, and I thought this would be the best place to record this week's video commentary because of the content. This past Sunday, we kicked off a new sermon series through Hebrews chapter 11 that we're calling Second Wind. Here is the big idea of the sermon series. Uh, we must walk with endurance. That's how Hebrews 10 ended, and truthfully, how Hebrews 12 starts. And some of the motivation that we have to walk by faith is because we have all of these witnesses around us who have set an example for us in how we are to live. And so each week through this series, we're looking at different sources or examples of faith through which we can follow and find hope and motivation for a second win. We would naturally think most of those examples would be people. For example, when we look at Hebrews chapter 10, Hebrews chapter 11, it's often called like the heroes of the faith chapter. We look at Abel and Enoch and David and all of these examples. But interestingly, in verse 3, we see the first example is not a person, but it is creation. And that's why I thought, what a more beautiful place to discuss this than in front of the ocean. I won't re-preach the whole sermon from this past week. In fact, if you missed it, I encourage you to go back and check it out on our website. But I do have my coffee. I'm going to take my time and enjoy a cup in this beautiful view. Glad you're with me today. I have often said and firmly believe, in fact, Hebrews 11 verse 3 is one of the reasons why, but a proper understanding of creation and origins is crucial for understanding and applying the gospel. And in fact, the gospel story begins in Genesis 1 and 2. It does not begin in Romans 3. Oftentimes when we share the gospel story, we want to start with, well, for all have sinned. Okay? Well, Genesis 3 then is the fall, and we understand that. But it actually starts before that when we see God creating man in his image, walking in communion with him and in relationship. Relationship and God's desire for relationship with man is the beginning of the gospel. Therefore, understanding creation and origin is important. I put a teaser in the sermon this week that we will talk today about some of the reasons why I would suggest that Scripture and creation points to a young earth where God created the world by his spoken word only in 7 literal 24-hour days. I realize that a lot of us have different opinions on how this happened. This has been debated for thousands of years. If you're curious to study more, I'll tell you some resources that you can check out. Answers in Genesis would be a good starting point. The Creation Research Institute would be another good starting point, where many believing, God-fearing men and women who are in the science world have worked diligently to build a good scientific model for creation, but specifically young earth creation. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be a scientist, but I have studied it a lot. I encourage you to embark on that journey. For today, though, I want to encourage you with two thoughts. One is biblical, the other is practical, both of which suggest that God created the world in 24-hour days, and the earth is very young. We'll start with this, a warning. A lot of times as believers, we have the tendency to solely develop an argument for creation based upon Scripture. And that is beautifully helpful for us who already have an acceptance of the authority of Scripture, then certainly we can build an argument fully off of that foundation. It is helpful, but it is not fully sufficient when we're developing an apologetics perspective and having a conversation with someone who doesn't accept the Bible as authoritative, inerrant, and infallible. But let's start theological after a cup of coffee. I guess I would say a sip of coffee, not a cup. We could be here for a while. First would be this: the Hebrew language is important. So the Hebrew word for day is yom. It's written all throughout Scripture, the Old Testament. And one common misconception or misunderstanding when we look at, well, God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested, and Scripture says that a day to God is like 1,000 years. So that suggests that it was 6,000 years, which could open the door to either a gap theory or God using evolutionary theory to create the world. Well, I understand the logic of that, but here's the problem. In the nuance of the Hebrew language, anytime that the word yom is used in connection with a number, it's referring to a literal day, 24-hour day. So if we're going to be consistent with how the Hebrew language works, and we look at the creation account, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day, well, that would be suggesting that it was a 24-hour day. There are several other examples of what Scripture says, but let me use a practical example. Another sip of coffee, if you would. It's a beautiful morning. Several years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to travel to San Francisco. I was going there for a work trip when I was working for the mission board, and we went a couple days early, and we took the opportunity to check something off of my bucket list, and that is to see the redwood forest. So we drove up north of San Francisco into the near woods, and we were there early in the morning. The park had just opened. So we walked for a while and didn't see anyone, and we were amazed by the beauty of the trees and the density of the forest and the size of these monstrous trees. And a few minutes or whatever had passed on our journey, and a park ranger walked by. And if you ever been around me, I don't have any problem talking with a stranger. So I struck up a conversation with the ranger, found a little bit about who she was, and started asking questions about the forest because I was curious to know. And she said this. She said, science has confirmed that the Muir Woods Forest north of San Francisco is a virgin, uncut forest, and the trees date to be 10 to 15,000 years old. And then she said, well, of course we know the earth is older than that, but this forest is virgin and uncut. I, we thanked her for her time, and I walked away immediately saying, here, this park ranger, not even knowing intentionally what she's saying, is giving us evidence that suggests that the earth is only 10 to 15,000 years old. If science is saying here is a measurable, uncut virgin forest that's only 10 to 15,000 years old, well, would that not suggest that's how old the forest is? Hmm. See, here is the importance and the patience. We could go on, both theologically or scientifically, and find evidence to suggest, but proof actually is a step of faith, which is why Hebrews 11:3 is important to look at creation in the context of all of these other physical examples. By faith, the earth was created. By faith, Enoch walked with God. By faith, on and on and on we go. We can look and find evidence that builds a stronger case with evidence that suggests the truth, but ultimately, it's a step of faith for you and for me to understand how God created the world and why He created you and me to walk in relationship with Him. I hope this has encouraged you today, or at a minimum, spurred some thought, or given you an opportunity to enjoy a cup of coffee with me in front of the ocean. I hope you have a great week. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Check out our website, explore around for more information. We're here to help. God bless. See you next time.